Listen, do you have any idea how many cups of coffee I've had? It's a large number of cups of coffee. With the Ryzen 3000 XT launched, reviews have been a little bit more mixed than I expected. I mean, the price hasn't really changed. The silicon quality has apparently gone up. Is the I/O die 12 nanometers now? I don't even know. So, this is the MSI B550 MPG Gaming Carbon Wi-Fi. It's about a $200 B550 motherboard. It's pretty decent. Middle of the road, not too many features. Yes, you can get the Tomahawk. It's a really interesting motherboard. It started out, with like the 350, and then MSI really nailed it with the 450. The 550 version of the Tomahawk is a little bit more expensive than this board. A little bit higher end, has some different features. But this board caught my eye because it does have some high-end features, but without being ostentatious. It's also not a board that has a bunch of stuff that you're not actually going to use. Let's take a look. Now there are CPUs coming. At the time that I'm shooting this video, we've got basically the Ryzen 3000 series and the 3000 XT series. But if you notice on the box, it says not compatible with the 3400G and the 3200G. Those are Zen Plus CPUs that have integrated Vega graphics. But I think we're nearing the release of new Ryzen CPUs that will have more cores and also have integrated Vega graphics, because this motherboard does have HDMI and DisplayPort out at the rear I/O. So what does that tell you? The big difference in chipset between B550 and X570 on the AM4 platform is PCI Express 4. B450 technically has zero PCI Express 4. You can't even use PCI Express 4 with that M.2 slot that connects directly to the CPU, even though Ryzen 3000 CPUs in general are PCI Express 4.0. B550 changes that, it upends it. You can have PCI Express 4.0 for your primary X16 slot. You can have PCI Express 4.0 for your primary M.2, but the chipset itself and all of the peripherals connected to the chipset are either PCI Express 3 or PCI Express 2. So most motherboards that are on the B550 platform will have a single M.2 connected directly to the CPU that you can enjoy those blistering fast PCI Express 4.0 speeds, and then there'll be a secondary M.2 that's PCI Express 3.0 by 4. One of the awesome things about the chipset, the B550 chipset, is it can take all those relatively lower speed peripherals that are running at PCI Express 3.0 speeds and lower, aggregate them and send them up to the CPU. And unlike on Intel's platform with DMI 3.0, generally it's not going to bottleneck because you've got more bandwidth available on the B550 platform than you do on the competing platform. To be sure, X570 has a lot more bandwidth. So if you're going to run multiple high performance M.2, you're going to run multiple high performance PCIe devices, something like that, you're going to want the X570 chipset. But also there's no fan. So the X570 chipset, it required a cooling fan because those chips ran hot. B550, that's not the case. As you can see, no fan. I think it's also going to be the case that even though around launch this isn't true, but I think it's going to be the case that not too long after launch, the B550 motherboards are going to be relatively less expensive than their X570 counterparts. But that's not going to be universally true because AMD leaves it up to the board partners. They seem to have a lot more freedom than Intel's board partners do, in the sense that there's a huge variability in B550 motherboards. There are some B550 motherboards that have 16 power phases, and there are some B550 motherboards that are in a 4+1 configuration. To be sure, this motherboard is great when paired with something like a Ryzen 3600X, XT, 3800. If you want to put a 3950X CPU in this motherboard, you totally can. It's got the VRM for it. It's got the layout. It's got everything else. Everything is going to run just fine at stock with this motherboard. The places where it does make a little bit of a sacrifice, you've only got a single NIC. However, it is a 2.5 gigabit NIC, so that's a nice feature. There's maybe a little bit less USB connectivity, but it still maintains a single USB 3.0 header and a single USB, Type-C header for the front panel. We've also got two USB 2 headers for internal peripherals, things like water pumps or power supplies that connect directly to USB 2, and some cases, like the Fractal Define 7, have mixed USB 2 and USB 3 front panel ports. One place where this board does not cut any corners or skimp is fan headers. You've got 7 fan headers to work with on this motherboard, which will work with even the most demanding configurations, the aforementioned Ryzen 3950X, not a problem. In terms of RGB headers, you do have the 5050 header, you've got the digital header, and then of course you've got the Corsair header as well. Technically there are 2 rainbow headers, one at the top of the motherboard for the CPU and things that are CPU related, and one at the bottom edge of the motherboard, but hey, not a problem. You can just connect the single 8-pin CPU power. The system is going to be plenty stable, even if you're running a 16-core. Let's take a quick look at the rear I/O. So the rear I/O, we've got DisplayPort and HDMI, as I mentioned before. BIOS flash button, so you've got all the support that you would ever need for future generation CPUs, no problem. You can just flash it directly from a USB stick. Combination PS2 mouse and keyboard port. You've got 2 USB 2 ports, which you imagine are for USB mouse, keyboard, other low-speed peripherals. Then you've got a stack of 4 USB ports, two more USB 2 ports, 2 USB 3 ports, super speed. Then you've got 10 gigabit ports, 1 Type A and 1 Type C. It's a nice touch. And then we've got our 2.5 gig LAN. We've also got our Intel Wi-Fi 6 dual antenna connection. And of course the included basic AF rubber duck antennas. It'll do the job, but I always like to have detachable antennas. Then we've got our Realtek ALC 1200 integrated audio codec. In terms of memory support, you've got something very important to note. While Ryzen does support error correcting memory, this motherboard will detect and use error correcting memory. However, the error correction function is not qualified or enabled. So even though you can use ECC memory and it'll boot with ECC, this motherboard doesn't actually support ECC. So if you were thinking about using this as the basis for your home server, don't do it. A delightful surprise in the memory configuration was memory speeds. So if you've got 1 DIMM per channel in single rank memory, that'll top out at 4866 megahertz. However, if you're running the worst case scenario, which is dual rank, 2 DIMMs per channel, it's gonna top out at 3600. So dual rank, those will be like 32 gig DIMMs. When we say single rank, dual rank, it just means the density of memory. To an extent, it means the density of memory on the DIMM. So single rank, something like an 8 gig stick of memory, and dual rank, well, you could have single rank 16 gig as it turns out, but 32 gig dual rank is usually what you're looking at. So 32 gig dual rank, 4 DIMMs, 3600 is the maximum that the motherboard will support. Although AMD support is quite a bit less than that when you look at what's officially supported by the CPU and the memory controller and that sort of thing. Now the PCIe layout on this motherboard, it's a trap. It's a little bit of a trap. It looks like it's a by 8 by 8 configuration, because if you look at the back and you look at, you know, the solder points that are available on the board, it looks like there's 8 lanes worth of solder points here. Not the case. It's actually 4 lanes worth of solder points here for the second slot. So this primary slot is X16 4.0 to the CPU. I kind of hinted at that a little bit in the beginning. This slot is PCI Express 3.0, 4 lanes directly to the CPU. So things get interesting with the second M.2 slot. The second M.2 slot could potentially drop down to PCI Express 2.0 depending on what combination of peripherals you're using with this machine. And of course, the PCI Express 1 devices are all connected to the chipset, and they're all PCI Express 3.0. You've also got to be careful because this X1 slot between the primary slot and the X4 slot, if you populate that by 1 slot, it could limit your M.2 to just 2 lanes of PCI Express. So try to avoid using this PCI Express by 1 lane, and you won't have any problems. It is very important when you buy a motherboard to pay attention to the PCIe layout. If in doubt, consult the manual. You can always download the manual for a motherboard before you actually buy the motherboard, because it's like, oh, I'm gonna get an X1 capture card, an X1 sound card, and a bulk storage M.2, and then a really fast M.2. That's not an unreasonable configuration, but depending on which slot you put things in, things may not actually perform optimally. That said, I think for an ordinary computer, this is plenty of PCI Express connectivity. It's more than you really need for a normal computer. It's fine. You don't need to go overboard. And the aforementioned capture card, external sound card, I mean, most people don't really even do that. Most people will buy a graphics card, maybe not even when the new 8-core APUs are out. But most people will buy a graphics card. That's about it. Storage, SATA, M.2, it just depends. That's another thing. Depending on which SATA ports you use, some of the SATA connectivity is shared with PCIe, so consult the manual, otherwise things may not perform as they should. If you're trying to mix a high-speed PCI Express peripheral with a SATA peripheral, the SATA peripheral may be using up PCIe lanes, and you just move the SATA connection over to one of the other SATA ports, and that problem goes away. But who really has 6 SATA devices in their computer? engagement challenge. In terms of Linux support and how things work on Linux, it's a pretty good situation on Linux. The 2.5 gig LAN is the only thing that's even a little bit sketchy, and if you've got a remotely recent Linux kernel, the LAN connectivity is not really going to be much of a problem. This would be a great motherboard for the 3600, as I mentioned, 3600X, 3600 XT. 3600 XT is a little nice for developer workloads because you do get that single core boost. So if you're doing like web development or a lot of small files with something like Node.js, picking the right SSD and a CPU like the 3600 XT might be worth the extra $100, but the 3600 is sort of the deal of the century on a 6-core processor included cooler. I mean, you could basically just set that up in a cardboard box and have a really nice computer compared to, a nice computer from what it cost a few years ago. Like, Ryzen's exciting. The one negative on and it's not really much of a negative, is on the Linux IOMMU side. Of course, the PCIe layout here is not conducive if you're going to run VFIO, and even if you were going to run VFIO, everything is hanging off of this B550 chipset, which is half of the motherboard, is in the same IOMMU group. Things are not isolated. You'd have to use the ACS patch. That can lead to stability issues. So not a motherboard I would recommend for IOMMU virtualization, virtualizing a Linux gaming machine. And that's probably still going to be true even after the APUs plus Vega come out, because the PCIe lane situation is still going to be limited there because of the internal chip topology. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Be sure to look out on the Level 1 Linux channel for a separate video on that. But in general, I think I'm not really recommending B550 much for IOMMU, as I haven't found a B550 motherboard and BIOS combination that has a satisfactory to me IOMMU combination. But hey, if you've got a recent BIOS or something like that, or you want to check what the up-to-the-minute information is, come to the Level 1 forums and we'll have that info. If you're building a Linux workstation and you're going to run a virtual machine, you'll be fine. It's just the PCI Express pass-through stuff that is what I'm talking about. Virtualization support, everything is pretty great here on the Ryzen platform. This motherboard is no different. It is a very solid, budget-oriented, about $200 option. I do like, if you're looking to trade up a little bit, check out the Tomahawk, because it's got an extra LAN, a little bit more USB connectivity. It's got some other nice features. Check it out. I'm Whittle, this is Level 1. This has been a quickie, not a quickie, motherboard review. Did Linux testing. Basically everything's okay. Sensors detect, it's pretty good. I really like what MSI is doing with their B550 lineup. I really like that the power delivery is solid, because you want an overbuilt power delivery system if you're going to use the machine for 2, 3, 4, 5 years. And for even the 3950X, the power delivery system here is pretty overbuilt. So good job, MSI. I'm Whittle, this is Level 1. I'm signing out. I'll see you later.